All right, morning, everybody. Um, well, when I go back, well, my presentation will focus largely on trying to give some realistic portrayal of what our local situation is back home as it relates to the violence, particularly gang violence, gun-related violence, and its impact on the subculture of violence in some of our most volatile communities, and how we have managed to engage those situations. When I go back home on Monday, I have a meeting with a particular community in Parade Gardens called Tel Aviv. About 2,000 people living there, but they have lost about 20 persons in 2 years. Related to gang violence. Essentially, it's a group of youths, maybe about 30 of them, who were part of one big gang, and they broke away from the leadership and decided that they wanted to have their own autonomy, which is about 2 or 3 streets down from where the headquarters of the base of the gang exists. And those youths, they were responsible for maybe about 25 of the 30 killings from the other side. And their main issue is that the leadership of the gang didn't share resources equally. And so for them, they need to go off on their own and start their own enterprise. We have met with these groups and these 2 groups in conflict and managed to mediate with them and have an agreement on a ceasefire. And that has been in place now for about 2 months. We have weekly meetings with these groups. But there are big issues to address, of these 30 youths who have broken away from the gang. I think the leader is about 24 years old. And these guys are well armed. They are not wanted by the police. There's no information on them. There's no one going to testify on them. They basically have nowhere to live because they left their homes on the other side of the community. So they are squatting around. And so we're in the middle of trying to establish rules and terms of agreement with the groups in conflict, such as guys not going on go in the open on the boundaries with weapons in their waists to intimidate other sections of the community. The guys not seeing guys walking by and throwing intimidatory barbs at them and so on and so forth. So we're in the middle of trying to preserve the ceasefire until we're able to build on that particular situation. I have another meeting in another community, Augusttown, and that particular community has gone through years of violence, and they're at the point right now where they have essentially established a council of leadership within the community, and they are setting up a framework, an incentive-based framework, where communities and different corners within the community who manage to reduce levels of violence in their own local spaces receive incentive-based awards and so on. And the community has moved from where we were in this Tel Aviv community to where they are now, where they have actually taken charge of the whole situation and developing methodologies and sustainable approaches to managing their own situations of violence in that particular community. And so the work that we do at the Peace Management Initiative ranges across different spectrums depending on where each community is. And it's very complicated and very wide-ranging. But how did some of these communities get here? Well, Jamaica has a deep history of political violence. Many of our communities in the 60s, 70s were mobilized around violence, using violence as a tool to intimidate geographical spaces so that they won't come out on the day of elections to vote and so on. And so voting patterns were effectively affected by using communities, arming communities, and labeling communities either one color or affiliated to one political party or the other. And that trend has evolved over time, where our communities now have now used that sense of divide and rule, and it is now ingrained and entrenched within the fabric of our communities. So where the main motive for a lot of the violence now is not politically related, it's turf oriented, but the same principles apply, where gangs now essentially carve up sections of the community and label it, give it their own labeling, and have that control of that section, so that it can have access to resources. So it's not before where you had huge blocks that were controlled by one political mobilizer who would be engaged by a political party, and he would bring home the votes, or he would make all the decisions and trickle on the information to the communities. Now it's a situation where some of the guys have gotten smarter, divided up these areas into pockets, where now if the politician comes in, he has to deal with 10 different corners instead of one political mobilizer. So the violence is a lot more turf-oriented now, lots of corner gangs. One of the things we have had to deal with is how we approach corner gangs as against the more organized criminal networks. I would say there are probably about 5 really entrenched organized gang networks in the country. Most of the other gangs are really corners or community spaces that have inherited violence over time, conflicts as it relates to up the road doesn't like down the road, or there's still some boundaries as it relates to political affiliations and so on. The violence we encounter daily is really cyclical. And while the law enforcement focuses a lot on gang violence, within our organization we tend to focus a lot on community violence, because that paints a true picture of how complicated our situation is. In our communities, the police will go in and say they dismantled a gang on Bryden Street, but Bryden Street has maybe 500 people living on it. And if you take out the 10 guys who you have profiled and believe are involved in gang activity, you don't dismantle that gang, because Bryden Street is made up of families, and the families, each family would have maybe a brother, a cousin, or nephew who's part of the gang, and so on. And so in order to treat with these types of communities, you actually have to treat with the wider community, and look at families themselves, what roles the women play, what roles the children play, what roles the schools play in the surrounding environment. Within these communities, it's a rite of passage for many youths inheriting this life of violence. The guns now symbolize respect, power, identity. There are youths who, the other day I went to a meeting, a young man said he was hungry. He has basically about 3 rifles buried in his backyard, but he won't sell them for love or money, because that is what gives him his respect, his sense of power, his sense of authority. He could get almost 250,000 Jamaican dollars for one of those, but that's where he puts his value. And so he will go hungry just to maintain that status quo within his community. The communities have become increasingly polarized, as I said before. We now deal with minor pockets of violence. It's very difficult to map any geographical space anymore as it relates to who are the antagonists, who are the conflicting parties. So this subculture violence runs deep in our communities. The excesses of violence not only seen in the violent use and display of weapons. We have low school attendance, high rates of teen pregnancy, high rates of school dropouts, environments conducive to violence, poor health practices, high levels of unemployment, high levels of exposure to violence. Many of our communities are desensitized, high levels of abuse against children, high levels of abuse against women, and the existence of other forms of domestic and interpersonal violence. One of the communities we work in, Marchpen, we randomly selected 50 youths to be part of a pathway program on the basis that they were, one, not in school or employed. The group, the profile of the group, they were 15 to 27 years old. We were shocked to find out that 60% of them were arrested at least once, 78% of them dropped out of school, 60% grew up in a single parent household, 80% of them dropped out of school because of a lack of money, 80% had a family member killed, and 70% were involved in gang activity. And these were youths who were just randomly selected from the community. The PMI or types of programs focus on violence interruption and trauma reduction primarily to get the ceasefire, as in a community like Tel Aviv. But we also do a lot in terms of community safety planning and empowerment, getting the wider community, such as Augustone, to become part of the process and the solution. We have a gang demobilization program focusing on the most high-risk youth, like in Marchpen, doing case files on these youth and connecting them to mainstream opportunities. And we also do a lot of community engagement to change values. How do we move communities from being having these strong political affiliations and conflicts to having more mobility across the communities? Brownstone is one community in which we've had success in transitioning a community forward. We see in there about 50 persons were killed in a little over a year, 2004, 2005. And our interventions were quite successful. We had to bombard that community. That's what works for us in these communities after we have done the firefighting, empowering residents to get involved, offering gang members the opportunities, and connecting the work of the community with similar campaigns that we're carrying out in other communities so they feel connected to a broader process. Between 2005 and 2015, less than 25 persons have been killed over this 10-year period as opposed to back in 2004. And the community has taken charge of its own safety and has become more open and more accessible for development work. And generally, the schools and the surrounding environment has benefited a lot from this, and the governance structures within these communities have improved significantly. So that is the type of work that we do on a day-to-day basis. The previous presenter, a lot of what she said would apply structurally to the situations that take place within the local context of Jamaica. We've seen a lot of this now in Trinidad and St. Kitts and some of our neighboring communities, Bahamas. But you know, it's a struggle. We're working a lot with Elizabeth at the Violence Prevention Alliance now to develop frameworks to measure and to see how we can apply structurally some of the successes we've had to some of the other communities that we're moving into now, into St. Catherine and Montego Bay. Thank you.